wielding.
A concept we see in pop culture all the time.
Everyone's using it, like Thorfinn from Vinland Saga.
Ahsoka from Star Wars.
Kratos from God of War.
Sun Jin-woo from Solo Leveling.
Kirito from Sword.
Stop. If we're gonna list everybody who uses dual wielding, we'll be here all day.
Okay, I guess the real question is dual wielding effective?
Well, that's what this video is about.
Oh wow, what a coincidence.
You're welcome.
So is dual wielding effective?
Yes.
Wow, that was easy.
Video over.
Wait, no, hold on. We're trolling you. There's a lot of context to unpack.
Why is dual wielding so effective? If I'm dual wielding, I can defend with one hand and attack with the other hand. And better yet, I can do it simultaneously.
You can also attack in rapid succession, targeting different openings, which makes it very hard for your opponent to parry. Quick caveat, with cutting motions, it's not usually a good idea to attack two different lines at the same time because this messes with your body mechanics. You need to use the chain of the body to make a good cut, and it's hard to do that in two different directions at the same time. You might be able to do it high and low, like this, but generally, it's in succession, not together. The biggest advantage of dual wielding is
two things are better than one.
The ability to attack rapidly in succession
or defend and attack simultaneously
is just super OP.
It just gives you more options.
So why don't we always dual wield?
Well, for one thing, it's hard.
It's difficult enough to learn how to use a sword in the first place. Learning how to use a second thing is even harder.
And when both parties have two weapons, it leads to more double kills.
It's great when your opponent only has one thing and you have two because you have more options than them.
But when both parties have double the weapons, there's so much going on.
It's easy to get lost in the sauce and end up both dead. But beyond those concerns, what about simple practicality?
Carrying around two things is more obnoxious than carrying around one thing.
Unless you've specifically been summoned to a duel and you have somebody to help you carry your crap, you've now got to carry this stuff around all day.
And while rapier and dagger isn't that big of a deal to carry around,
this would be pretty obnoxious.
And this is why most of the dual wielding we see is done with a longer sword and a shorter sword.
Or with two shorter swords. Another reason why you might not dual wield is because you prefer using your offhand. Instead of a dagger, you can do a lot of stuff like slapping the blade away. Now, there's no reason why you wouldn't just carry it and not use it, but this is a reason why you might not dual wield.
One of the reasons you might prefer an open offhand is you just haven't trained in two weapons, so you don't use two weapons.
If you don't know how to do it, don't do it.
So let's talk about some of the most common types of dual wielding, like sword and dagger.
The most common example is the rapier and dagger, but there are also other examples like the espada y daga from Filipino martial arts.
The reason this is popular is because it's pretty easy.
A dagger is small enough to carry without being super in the way, and it complements the sword very well. One of the most iconic versions of this outside of the Western world is katana
and wakizashi. We don't have a wakizashi.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
The style was made incredibly famous by Miyamoto Musashi, who used katana and wakizashi in his training.
There were tons of other examples of one-handed sword and dagger, so it was pretty clear it was popular, but why?
The reason this is so popular is because you have two different items, each with their own job. This is mostly focused on defending, and this is mostly focused on attacking.
This is even more pronounced when your opponent only has one sword, because they have to defend and then attack. I can do both simultaneously. And because each of these has a different job, it's generally easier to train than two swords of the same length.
And speaking of swords of the same length, there are a lot of examples of dual wielding swords of the same length, like the da,
hook swords,
and many other variations. Generally, this is a little bit more complicated because each of these can attack and defend, and in most of the martial arts that you see them, they're fluctuating between each fluidly.
Now there is an interesting cultural difference here, usually between East and West.
Most of the martial arts that dual wield swords of the same length are Eastern cultures. Thai, Filipino, Chinese, you even see some of it in the Russian shashka.
Of course there's going to be exceptions, but these are the most common.
In these cultures, art and martial arts are highly intertwined. So you do get a lot of forms, you do get a lot of flashy movements, and that's not bad. It's just different than the European martial arts that are more sparring based.
There are versions of this that do spar, like Arnis.
But even within those, the scoring philosophy is a little bit different. If you look at Arnis, it's continuous fighting. It isn't hit and then retreat, treating these as if they were deadly blades.
A lot of it goes hand in hand with stick fighting.
Just to clarify, we're not saying this is good or bad. It's just an interesting difference that we've noticed.
That combining of art and martial arts mean that these are complex and complicated systems.
This is a bit of a stark difference between the more utilitarian style of a Western sword fighting. Another interesting fact about dual wielding shorter swords is it's a lot easier to carry. These are short and more compact, and most of them don't have complex hilts, which means they fit pretty easily on your hip.
Even something more complex in shape like these are still pretty flat, so carrying them around wouldn't be as difficult as a bigger, longer sword.
Speaking of bigger swords,
can
you dual wield two full-size swords?
Yes, but not like that. While much rarer, there are accounts and even manuals about dual wielding two full-size swords, but almost always one-handed swords.
The problem with dual wielding two-handed swords is they're two-handed swords. You need two hands for each. So unless you've got an extra set of arms, ain't happening.
We do have examples of dual wielding rapiers, side swords, sabers, shaskas, and I'm sure there's other options out there. But these were generally done as a show of skill, a training exercise, or just for fun.
Earlier period longswords, sometimes referenced as hand-and-a-half swords, could be used in one hand, but you wouldn't really want to put another sword in the other hand, and here's why. This hand-and-a-half style longsword developed from the arming sword. You can see the handle is longer, as is the blade, and that meant that it had a lot more options. The biggest option it had was to put the second hand on here, and now there's a bunch of cool techniques you can do with it. You can use leverage, and that length comes in handy too. But even though this could be used in two hands, it was still short and light enough to be used in one hand, which meant it was perfect to pair with a shield. Sword and shield is one of the best combinations because you have an excellent defender and you have a good attacker. There is no reason to give up the advantages and maneuverability that a two-handed sword offers to pair it with a sword instead of a shield. This is far less useful at defending than a shield is, and having an offhanded sword is far less useful than having two hands on this sword for the added structure and power. Now I know people are gonna mention Miyamoto Musashi and how he used two katanas,
But it's not quite what you probably think.
Miyamoto Musashi did advocate training with a katana in either hand, but it wasn't so you could be good in battle, it was for strength and conditioning, so both of your arms could be strong. He did, however, advocate katana and wakizashi, the much shorter blade.
Now it's worth noting that while the katana is a one or two-handed sword, it's much shorter than something like a rapier and would generally fall more into the category of a shorter sword than a full-size one-handed sword. So why was two full-size one-handed swords so rare?
Well, it's for all the reasons we talked about previously. It's awkward to carry around, it's expensive to get two full-size swords, it takes more skill to wield both of them. Generally, the benefits don't outweigh all of the inconveniences. Now, we can't talk about dual wielding without talking about dual wielding daggers. On the surface, dual wielding daggers isn't necessarily bad given certain context. If my opponent doesn't have anything, this is fantastic all day long. I'll do whatever I want to.
Personally, I would rather have an open offhand because I can control and stab even better.
But there are systems of knife fighting that do use two weapons.
But what if your opponent also has a knife?
So in this situation, it's not necessarily bad to have two knives, but I personally would prefer to have an offhand because there's certain things that I can do with that offhand that would be a lot harder to do with the dagger.
But let's be honest, if you're getting in a knife fight, you're getting cut. Maybe stabbed.
Don't get in knife fights.
Stop it. Get some help.
But the problem with dual wielding daggers, especially in pop culture, is we almost always see it done like this. The problem with the situation is effective range. He can hit me way before I can hit him. And sure, I might be able to parry one of these strikes, but I don't have the range to immediately riposte him like I could with a rapier. And the time it takes me to close in gives him plenty of time to redouble his attack. This is such an uphill battle, it's basically a foregone conclusion.
So while it does show how quick and strong and powerful and skilled your MC is, it's always a storytelling tool.
It's never a realistic depiction of how this would go in that scenario.
Now, unfortunately, we can't talk about dual wielding without talking about reverse grip.
But don't worry, we'll make it short. A lot of people advocate for a style with one sword forward and one sword back.
The problem is, it don't work that way.
For all of the reasons that reverse grip is bad in your dominant hand, it's still bad in the non-dominant hand. It doesn't add anything, it's bad at parrying, it's bad at reach. A lot of people seem to think that this is a great defensive thing. We have multiple videos showing how it's not. So we're not gonna get super deep into it here other than to say, it doesn't work, and if you need to know why it doesn't work, I have a video just for you right here.
The next thing to talk about is shields.
The most common usage of thing and other thing is sword and shield, but personally, I don't think this counts as dual wielding.
When people talk about dual wielding, they generally mean two swords or a sword and a dagger, not a shield.
With that said, this is probably the most useful version of using one thing and another thing. You have an active defense that's very good at defending, and you have an active attack that's very good at attacking. It's the ideal combo, and there's a reason that it was used in almost every civilization.
It's also by far the easiest to train. If you don't know how to use a shield or a buckler, and you just hold it out, it's probably gonna block a lot of stuff.
While we've shown you examples of dual wielding from tons of different cultures all over the world and giving you examples of how it does work and how it doesn't work, we still have to acknowledge that dual wielding was never as popular as using a single implement.
So why is dual wielding more popular in pop culture than it was historically?
And the answer to that is kind of self-explanatory. It looks really cool.
And it makes your character look badass.
Watch your profanity.
It's a great storytelling tool to show that your character is either super strong, super skilled, or in some way stands out from the other characters who are all using one weapon. And this is why so many MCs dual wield.
While we're oversaturated with MCs and big bads that all dual wield,
inside of each of those individual stories, individual universes, usually only one character dual wields because they're special. It's just everybody had the same idea and they made all of their MCs dual wield, so it's kind of getting boring. So to wrap things up,
dual wielding absolutely existed and was good.
It is practiced by cultures all over the world.
But it's not as common as pop culture would have you believe.
And ain't nobody doing it with no long swords. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please consider supporting the channel for as low as $1 a month. It's a huge help and helps us keep making more videos like this one. You can also check out sellswordarts.com for links to training, gear, and all sorts of other stuff.